Hey, welcome back to Reading Rumblings in Remarden. I know it's been a little while. I've been traveling. I'm actually back in my hometown, in my home place, good old Virginia. But anyway, let's start. We are on chapter 13, Captive. Suddenly, the man fell on his belly, as the approaching ice clouds tried to knock him over. The mountain seemed as if it was against him, as a bull is to a caped man. They competed in this life-or-death struggle of survival, even though the rock had nothing to fear but scratches upon the mountain face. And yet, scratches do hurt even the sturdiest of people. So one could not blame the humongous boulder for reacting as it did. The rock tried its damnedest to shake this intruder on its land, and so to remove this tiny scratching off its surface, it sent wave after wave of concrete chunks of snow at this wearied traveler. He cowered on the tract of land, holding still, hoping that the mountain would instinctively feel his trembling heart and limbs, and show him some dwindling form of mercy. Luckily for him, it appeared that the mountain heard his plea and felt his cry, as the snow seemed to momentarily abate. His facial hair was sprouting out, and still tried to run so very far. Each bunch of follicles were like little imps with their tiny legs, running so they could not manage to get more than a hand's length away. His mustaches lay flat on his face, connecting closely to the fire on his chin. It frosted up with the ice raining down from both above and every other which way, so that by the time he had walked at least 10 feet, if he opened his mouth to breathe, all of the various shards melted. This man's hair, however, peeked out from under the protective rabbit-furred hat on all sides except the back. Annoyingly, instead of wanting to be kept warm and protected on his scalp, it always wanted to flee from his face. The hair kept brushing against the tippy top of his nose, as if it were trying to reach down into his mouth in order to choke him. Malevolently, it forced itself onto his thoughts as he brushed it aside and stuck it under his cap. Against the hard wind struck hard against him. The man was not expecting it at all. The brash breeze almost threw him completely off of that tactless path. The cold stones and sinewy snow moved underneath his clawed feet, as they tried to find a hold and avoid slipping down the mountain. The wind blew harder and harder against him, tugging at his earthy leather and sheepskin coat. He had an idea that it would be this bad on the mountain, but nothing in his short lifespan could have prepared him to face this onset of immense winds, what had now turned into chunks of hail. His feet came from under him, in an almost comical way with which how little resistance he put up. He struggled with hands and knees flailing against the surface of the mountain, as he lost the grip on that path. He went stumbling, inch by bloody inch. His body scraped against grating slabs as he fell. The world went spinning, as the cold shuddered against the sheepskin-bound arms and torso. In those minuscule seconds of indistinct freefall, he felt the cold tear at him, as it tried to bring him all the way down to the luscious valley floor. His hands reached out wildly, trying to take hold of anything that might provide a way out of this unfortunate scenario. Finally, his almost frozen fingers found a ledge, just barely able to hold even a mountain goat. He hung there for a split second, with hope racing through his clouded mind. About 15 feet from that abandoned path, found that clumsy man rolled into a ball, his hands hugging at his sides, grasping and rasping for air. His body needed time to heal, time which he did not have. Many of us never have the time we need. Regrets started to spin in his ears and ring in his head. Why had he not just married young and had children? He would definitely be happier than he was now. Maybe he would have been a great farmer or a herdsman, protecting his flock against the wild ravages of wandering wolves. But no, he had decided it would be too hard or too boring of a life. This was not a man of contentedness. He was always striving to be better, have more, be the fastest, and yet he was also a lazy man full of contradictions. So, in his prior life, he had never achieved any of those things. Still, he was grasping onto his life now, for no one would tear it from him, be it man, beast, or mountain. His whiskers curled up in the cold harshness of the wind blown by the mountain range Samarson. The mountain itself seemed to be alive, both inhaling and exhaling gusts at every opportunity it had, like a man dying from pneumonia. It had to get every last gulp of air inside before it finally went dead and silent, where no one would even consider it alive before. No man living and breathing in this here land knew when that day would come. No one even across the whole wide span of the world would know it, nor would they know in what manner it would go, or how many people it would take with it. People good, people bad, peoples all in the queer murkiness and tints of gray, where morals indeed had no place to stand or sit. He needed time to get away from this dastardly wind. He looked long left, and then a furtive look to his right. The furtive look worked, and he spotted what could only look to be a tiny cavern with the unaided eye, a little way off from that indistinct path, trudging through the snowbanks which had built up in that lonely place. He crouched down to get into that lonely-looking cave. Finally, he thought, some warmth from the cold. His eyes were still adjusting from the twilight of the outside to the grim dark of that dripping cavern. By that point, Eneptius could barely feel his body. His eyes were without seeing. His limbs were without moving. He felt nothing, but he felt he was there. Thoughts swam about in this limp pile of meat. Eneptius didn't know what was happening, where he was, who he was near, who had hit him. He felt an impulse, a weak feeling pulsing through his body. It hit down into his calf. Something moved. Flesh shifted up for a second. What had happened? What had he seen and felt? Eneptius did not know what was going on in his world anymore. He could only accept and evolve in whatever world he was in now. Another impulse. This one went down to his heel. Eneptius felt the bottom of his foot shift for a second. Then, nothing. The impulse fled as soon as it hit, and then another feeling was sent down the line towards another part of his body. A toe, this time, moved up and down. A sound. Something was moving out there, some sort of noise. His ears started to register sounds again. "Have you seen all this?" A gruff voice resounded in whatever room this was. "These? Yes, I've seen 'em. There's so many. Look at all of this money. We'll be rich for life. What do you plan on doing with your half?" A rather whiny voice came undulating in that place. "Half? What do you mean, half? Half is going back to that elf. Maybe you'll get an eighth. But I'll wind up with a fourth." The gruff one was triumphant in his assurance of this number. "Pfft, fourth. We'll see who he gives more to. You know, I'm his favorite. I'll wind up with all the money in the end. Just you watch. You and I can cheat that man out of his money. You know how much he has? A ridiculous amount. He's got at least 5 times as this. You and me, we can trick him easy enough." The wine droned on in his glee at cheating his employer out of his money. Eneptius's head started to kick in finally with an amazing amount of pounding. 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 The voices didn't help, but added to the pain that was there now. There was a thud from a punch landed hard into her chest. The gruff one said, "Shut up, Oaklix. The elf treats us well enough. Don't try to jinx it, you idiot. I plan on taking out all those whores at the tavern. I'll have one night of utter glory. The rivers will flow with the vodka I'll get. Ha! I'll have the best time in the entire village. Probably best in the whole of Ramarden." The gruff one continued snickering onwards at his varied imagination and what he would do with his cut. Annoying laughs joined in, probably from the other bandit there. The pounding kept going on inside of Ineptius's head. His eyes began to register sights again. The dark, the shadows, the two bodies crouching near the fire. He started looking around, slowly, to let his eyes start to become accustomed to the darkness there. Ineptius's eyes rolled around in his head to see whatever he was able to. His head still couldn't move. Nothing seemed to be able to, but at least the feeling was there. Uklis finished off his snickering and joined in the dreaming. "I'll buy the tavern, and make everything in it mine. One by one I'll acquire the village. Vrach, you join me. We'll do it all together. We'll start buying land, and we'll make our own town there. Trodnai, controlled by us. First, start with the tavern. Then everything will come with it." Everything. Yes. He fell into a musing daze, enjoying his dream. Ineptius slowly came to the realization that he had been tricked by that fucking elf, Yakov. Why would he do this? Those bastards always seeking after money? Those elves? He hadn't fully understood how bad they were before this experience. These two bandits wore pointed ears as well. Probably elves, but he could not fully tell in the darkness. They were in some sort of cave. The dwarf's eyes swept alongside all the walls that were surrounding them. The rough-hewn stone held its breath with the flames flickering off of the fire there. The oxygen was slowly being eaten up. Ineptius was surprised that he could even open his eyes wide enough to see any of this. There was some sort of film between what occurred in his head and what he saw there. It was hard to decipher what was actually going on. Ineptius tried to move his joints, or even to look down onto his body. His neck was blocked, and he could only stare forward from what he discovered when he did try to move his neck. He received a painful jab into the point where neck met shoulders. Ineptius tried not to utter a noise, and bear the pain. He gritted his teeth in response and rolled his eyes downward to see anything. The dwarf felt that his hands were sturdily bound together, with a thick piece of rope that ground into the soft flesh around his wrists. His feet were tied in the same manner, with no mercy being shown by these bandits. All of his goods were splayed out near the fire as those two rifled through them, but still held their attention on the shining coins in the firelight. There wasn't much there besides that coin pouch, his trusty blunted knife, and some bread he managed to slip from the army before he left. Still, they went back and forth bickering over something. This time the words weren't able to reach him. For some reason, they had started talking in what sounded like a panicked whisper. Ineptius tried to fiddle with that rope around his hands. Luckily it was tied in front of him, so if he strained his eye sockets just enough, he was able to see what he was working on there. His eyes started to hurt after about a minute of trying this went by. Luckily the bandits had just thrown him to the side, a little way from the fire, so the light was shining on him without him risking being noticed. The hardest part was not to make any noise while he did it. A dwarf always had a problem with that specific part of his body. Grunts were simply in Ineptius's nature. He didn't know how to get out of this predicament. Ineptius wasn't good at working with his hands, even though he farmed every day. He was good at doing what he was told, and good at muscle memory. This wasn't a part of either. Ineptius gnawed at his lip, as the ropes bit ever deeper into his fleshy wrists. He was leaned up against a rigid rock, near what seemed like the edge of the cave. Ineptius didn't know how to do this. How was he going to escape? His mind struggled with the fact that he was most likely going to die there. The dwarf's head still pounded from the constant onrush of blood to it. Thinking was difficult, yet he found a part of the stone that was just jagged enough to start the slow process of cutting through the rope. The panicked whispers continued from those two elves sitting around the campfire in the cave. Little slits of information reached his ears every now and again. What was that noise? Nothing. Just enjoy our bounty. Maybe we shouldn't go back with all of this loot. If he learns that you even thought, he's an old man. Power comes with money. Look at how powerful we'll be. Did you trap the entrance? I heard a click. Your imagination. Aneptius's eyes became heavy as they drifted around the cave, finally coming to a rest on the dagger held in his hand. He had managed to cut through the ropes and sidle over there. It was a curious blade, straight as a toothpick, and yet it was also blunted on one side of the blade's side, in which was shown the reflection of his clear, cornflake blue eyes and earthy hair. No amount of sharpening or grinding on the wheel would help this side, and indeed it seemed impossible that it would ever be better in the future. His father had given it to him when only so many planting seasons had passed. About 8. The planting of potatoes had only just ended when his father said, "This is a perfect instrument for cutting and mashing. I'm getting to the age soon where you'll have to do those things for me. So I think it's time that you learn how to do them." In that situation, his father was a wizened old dwarf soul, who had seen many crops grow and many fields fall fallow. He was an old dwarf during the time when his son had grown up, beard already well on its way to his knees, by the time the poor dwarf serf had started to work the fields. It was an unheard of occasion when a visitor upon any village would stumble across dwarves working the land. It seemed aeons ago, as his father told it, when some bedeviled ancestor of theirs in the past had created a major faux pas with the Dvarnin. The son had never learned what it was that his ancestor had done in order to deserve such a strong backlash and degradation in dwarven society, but it must have been something truly terrible. For some unknown reason, the bandits had left the blade unguarded. Sure, it wasn't a viable weapon, but it was still a lucky tool to have. For several minutes, the muttered conversation continued like this, while Aneptius struggled to fully undo his restraints again, after coming out of his daydream. He hardly had time to look up to see if anyone was noticing, but the dwarf didn't care. He was starting to get into a solid rhythm of moving his hands back and forth on that jagged outcropping. Aneptius muttered a prayer to Gorgonus for help in getting out of there, as an immediate impact was made into the rope on his wrist. His feet were going to be the easy part once his chubby hands were free. The rope started to noticeably thin when an echo rang throughout the cave. The noise was a cry in the gloom that hung. The low whispers were interrupted by brutal howling, now that must have been emitted from a humanoid body. Aneptius froze and looked up on the spot. He didn't see anything in the way there. In fact, he was having a hard time seeing anything at all. The cave submerged into a complete darkness, as the only campfire there seemed to disappear from this world. His eyes strained to readjust themselves in the pitch black that now pervaded all that he saw. There was one shadow, seemingly incredibly tall in stature. It wasn't a shadow, but a silhouette of something there. The panicked voices had now subsided in the close distance. Slowly it got replaced by something between a wheezing and liquid pouring out of some unknown vessel. That noise continued for several minutes as Aneptius struggled to reconcile whatever had just happened with what his mind was trying to show him now. The sounds were accompanied by an indistinct image brought into his brain by an unknown source. Things blurred in front of him. They turned into a very slimy shade of incredibly dark blue. The figure that had just first appeared over the bandits, now relinquished its height for a better position to attack its prey. Those poor souls had been taken completely by surprise by whatever that thing was. The noise kept inserting itself into Aneptius's brain as his mind tried to struggle with the image he was seeing there. It was some sort of humanoid, maybe an elf, resting on top of the two seemingly dead bodies now. That noise continued in full force against the blood pounding that never stopped hitting Aneptius's skull. The light that now held throughout the cave did nothing to alleviate that pounding either. It only proved to add to it. The noise stopped. The figure had now turned full stride to where the dwarf was laying on his side now. Aneptius saw the creature. He gasped in terror as it came hurtling towards him. This thing appeared to be the elf Yakov, except it couldn't have been. Blood poured from its mouth in a succinct motion whenever it opened its face. The eyes had taken on a demonic orange color, a deeper shade than any orange Aneptius had ever seen. The pupils stood out in how large they were on that creature. It sucked in all the light that was capable of entering into such a monstrosity. It wore a slightly faded and used tunic, much the opposite of what Yakov had been wearing earlier in the day. Aneptius whimpered down into the corner where he was at, and tried to make a similar prayer as he had earlier in the night. However hard he tried, he still struggled to utter out the name of his god. Groganus would simply not come to his tongue, as the fear began to totally overwhelm this young man. He broke out into a panic, and tried saying anything he could before going completely, utterly silent in the deadly ether of this creature. The monstrosity had swiftly reached him, and stood over the limp body of Aneptius, who was trying not to be noticed now. It stood imperious in the bloodbath of its own creation. Upon further inspection of Aneptius, a spark of recognition gleamed in those terrifying eyes. You, dwarf, decided to visit me at the wrong hours of the day. A half-slithering, half-nasal voice proceeded out of the creature. Everyone knows when my business hours are. They are sacred, so why interrupt me when I am resting? He intoned the last parts into a drawling that lasted for at least a minute. The creature lifted Aneptius up to the low ceiling of the cave, where he was knocked rudely against a stalactite. The bruise on his back was the least of his worries at this point, but it still added to the pain he was in. Soon, it seemed, that pain would end, and he would join with the other dwarves in the great beyond. The creature clenched its fingers even tighter into Aneptius's caftan, decimating the ornate stitchwork that was there. His mother had crafted it by hand, over days of love and care. But now, Aneptius's body tried to go completely limp out of fear, but that only made it more rigid in Yakov's grasp. The creature raised its other hand to clutch at the area near his lungs. It made one last look into his eyes, either out of lust for its next kill, or satisfaction at having righted a perceived slight. The blue haze Aneptius was seeing in the world, it now dissipated into an orange fireball that sailed throughout the cave in such a way that the winds were blowing at full speed. A whistling was accompanied with the object that flew through the air. It immediately caught the creature in the back by some miracle. This thing, this Yakov, this money-lending elf, now lit up like a holiday torch for the summer solstice. A shriek reigned in the dark emptiness of the cave as Aneptius dropped fully onto his side, with him very nearly being impaled by a stalagmite. The creature roiled around in seeming unrelenting pain. It simply wouldn't stop moving, even after Aneptius had regained his sight for the pitch blackness of that cave. The shrieks continued on as another, equally tall figure came out of the darkness, and Neptius didn't recognize that this new creature could be at first, but it drew ever closer to where the other lay writhing on the ground in agony. The new one drew something out of its pocket, before lighting up a torch and pushing it deeply into Yakov. And Neptius could now understand what this new agent was. Better yet, who it was. None other than his friend Marcellus had arrived on the scene to deliver him from Death's steely clutches. He wore short-cropped black hair, with not a strand for a beard. He was clean-shaven, and he had a handsome square jaw to go along with his mischievous brown eyes. And Neptius couldn't believe that his own eyes were telling him. He hadn't seen nor heard of his friend for years now. And Neptius hoped for the best, but with the times being as is, there was no knowing what had become of him. And there he was, the one, the only, Marcellus. One day he had just up and vanished from the village, without telling anyone, and Neptius had started to assume that the Isheki had grabbed him for using magic, but he had never seen his friend use it before this moment. The creature stopped writhing around on the floor of the cave, and Neptius still had the breath knocked out of him. He could hardly believe what the hell was going on. Marcellus bent his half-dwarf, half-elf body down to check on his old friend. What the... Is that who I think it is? Marcellus peered ever closer at the panting figure of the dwarf lying on the ground, and Neptius had still not caught his breath from what was going on. And Neptius slowly uncurled from the ball he was in. He tried standing, but he tripped over the bonds that held his feet together still. And Neptius landed flat on his chest, barely protecting his face. His grunt now moved throughout the cave, replacing all of the other previous sounds that still hung in his head. Marcellus shook his head and smiled down at his friend. Look where I find you. It's always inexplicable to me where I'll run into friends these days. He bent over and pulled out a long, sharp knife. He cut through the ropes holding together Neptius's limbs. Marcellus picked up his friend by his shoulders. Come on, up with you. No use lazing around. He embraced the dwarf in a hug that engulfed the short man. And Neptius finally smiled a tired smile, and wrapped his arms around this tall half-elf dwarf prototype. And Neptius never understood how this mixture came about, but love mixed throughout the races and heights. And Neptius parted reluctantly with his friend after several seconds passed by. The dwarf looked down at the creature that now occupied a spot with the dead in the cave. Luckily, Marcellus's torch lit the insides of that dark place. And Neptius stared at the thing on the ground, which was now curled up in a withered ball of crisply burnt flesh. What the hell was that thing, Marcellus? Marcellus looked at that monstrosity on the ground and said, Huh, well, it appears to me that it would be some sort of vampire. You know, I've been watching this guy for some time, but you gave me the opportunity to find him alone. And Neptius rubbed his limbs and sucked in a big breath of air. Oi, how did this thing wind up in our village? I thought everyone knew the elf. Neptius shrugged candidly. He was always just a moneylender. Marcellus nodded in approval. Just an elf. Just an exchanger of money. The Isheki were watching him. Ornorian had known something was wrong for some time. Here, let's start that campfire again. In the cave, both walked over to the smoking remnants of the fire. And Neptius was using the blunt side of the blade to light the flint with no success so far. After his respite, he turned it over to strike with the sharpened side. He didn't want to wear out the sharpened part of the dagger knowing that what he was up against now. But immediately the flint caught, and made sparks when he used the sharp side. He let out a sigh of relief and thought, finally, some real warmth. Then he hugged himself close to the fire. Marcellus sidled up against next to him. He unrolled the parchment stored in his pockets. Eneptius's friend handed it over to him. It was only partially damaged from the wet snow outside. The dwarf read it over once again. He didn't understand it at first, as he continued struggling with the written characters on that stiff page. His childhood was not full of the best training. Only very rarely did he have the time to pick up scraps of paper written on by the people at the tavern. He struggled each day standing at the village signpost trying to put together what those different letters were, and most importantly, what they meant. It wasn't until he was in his mid-teens that he got enough free time to visit the temple every week on Fridays in order to beg the priests over and over again to teach him. His grimy hands, dirty from the earth, tried hard to learn how to grip a feather pen. The priests visited him in their lunch breaks from time to time to make sure that the serf had not stolen or broken anything. Eventually, they learned to trust that his intentions were good, and even deigned to sit beside him and correct some of his mistakes. Drip, drip, drip. The water from stalagmites fell in a steady rhythm. That was somewhat of a good sign for him, since his water pouch had already started to run empty on the journey to get here. Hell, he was grateful enough that the bandits hadn't destroyed it. Once his eyes could see in that damp darkness, he was able to perceive large stalactites reaching their arms towards the heavens of the ceiling, and actually grab onto it. Any other exits to the cave were pleasingly blocked off by these formations, so it made it quite quaint for our wearied traveler. He noticed the still burning smolder of a bunch of sticks in the center of that cave. What could only be the remnants of a campfire. The damp had once again stifled the fire that he had made. He could still feel some warmth from it on his calloused hands as he pushed together the remaining sticks and pulled out his flint once again in order to light up the extinguished flames. The frost had started to make his hands shiver through his soft-spun sheepskin-lined leather gloves. He had great difficulty creating a spark. Once, twice, thrice, 4 times, 5 times. Over and over again he struck the dagger against it, hoping for that glimmer of light to fly off. He took a break waiting for the tremors in his hands to go away. It was nefariously cold outside. Even for a dwarf who was used to the constitutional difficulties of being in the freezing wind, he still had trouble wrapping his mind around why it was so damnably cold. He lit it again in a blaze that astounded Marcellus, though Eneptius still had trouble getting through the various characters on the page fast, or even at a decent reading speed. The letter read as followed. Eneptius sic Yrden. We have known each other for a long time, and you have served me well so far. I always thought of myself as a father to an obedient child. I know, times have been tough, but now I need you more than ever. There's a rumor of a great wealth of all manner of things to the north, and honestly, we need this. The crops have not failed yet, but all the signs are there. I know it in my old dwarven bones to be true. It is only a matter of time before our people start to die. Find the mountain named Goron. Do this, and your family shall be released forthwith from serfdom. Signed, Ornorian, Gersog of Atranaia. Eneptius grimaced, turned, and spat with what little saliva he had. Father my arse, he thought, and turned the page over once again to see a map portrayed in dark ink showing the Samerson mountain range with shoddy directions drawn on it. Now Ornorian was a cruel man, and Eneptius had no problem cursing that damnable bastard in his mind. where some Gersogs would simply leave their serfs alone. Ornorian was completely different. He took special care to place his armed men along all of the borders of his small holding, for fear that some other Gersog would come and try to lay claims to any portion of it. He then would take great interest in what each of his serfs were doing specifically. He would check up on them throughout the days to encourage them to work harder and faster. Most of the encouragement came through the rod. Ornorian gave ridiculous care to the Sicyurdan family of Neptius, since they were so disgraced as to be working in the fields with the other serfs, with the other humans. He did not know, nor care, what they had done in order to deserve such a humiliating fate, but he knew it must have been something terrible in the past. When Ornorian become a Gersog, there were already rumors about the family, and they had been serfs for as long as anyone could even remember. I'm not sure whether to hug you more for saving myself, or hit you for this letter. Looks like I'm working for an Ornorian now. Neptius hung his head in shame and loathing for his current situation. Marcellus patted him on the back for comfort. Don't worry, buddy. I was tasked the same. I was told to follow whatever was in that letter, so it looks like we just stumbled into the same spot. Hey, why did these bandits take you? And Neptius shrugged and reached through the bloody mess that made up the piles of human debris there. He struggled not to throw up in his pursuit of the coins that had been splayed out throughout the pile. He shook them off and wiped them off onto his rugged leather pants. The blood curled off of them in a way that made Neptius turn and spit. He collected all of the ducats, groats, and the single shekel together into his hands. I think they were looking for this. He held the money up for Marcellus to examine. The half-dwarf whistled in congratulations of his prize and said, "That is a lot of money. Who'd you steal it from?" Marcellus ignored the bodies on the ground and broke into laughter. He sobered up as Neptius pushed him feebly and said, "I didn't steal it from anyone. It was a gift. I need it for the journey ahead." Marcellus held the dwarf back with his hand on his shoulder in one swift movement. "Careful there, buddy. It's our money now. We're going to need it to outfit our expedition to the mountain. First, we have to get out of this cave and off of this mountain." He stood for a second thinking about the place. Wait, I think I've heard of that Goron before. The mountain Neptius was searching for was named Goron. It had a rather dreary history with the locals. Goron was previously the capital of the Great Northern Kingdom, but no longer. Wave after wave of snakes emerged from the rocks, which were built into the underground roads carved by the dwarves. There had always been rampant rumors of curious sightings and slithering sounds in the nights. Always the dwarves had told stories to their children about avoiding going out into the underground passages alone. Most of these children grew out of the fear instilled by their normally wise parents, though there were always those traveling wanderers who told of how serpents came out of nowhere in the utter and distinct darkness in order to capture their kind for sustenance. In many taverns throughout the land, people threw coins at these poor old souls, who obviously needed the money if they were telling such ludicrous tales. They both sat around the fire thinking of these things that had been told to them when they were youths. Chills ran through Neptius's spine as he thought of all those snakes conquering what must have been the fullest battalion of dwarves. How could they have been taken over so quickly? Neptius shook his head. Do you believe the stories that they tell of that place? Marcellus looked him in the eye from across the fire. I don't know, Aneptius. People repeat it over and over again, so there must be some truth to it. I guess we'll find out soon. The sun started to peek its red gaze out from behind the gray clouds. The two friends stood up in unison. Aneptius started speaking first. It's time we get going. How far up are we anyways? It's a solid couple of hours walk to the village. That vampire made it up here fast. But in your shape, we'll have to take it slow. Aneptius groaned as he stretched out and yawned widely. The sooner the better. Let's get moving. Marcellus stood back for a moment. Wait, I have to collect something. The tall half-elf smoothly jogged to the body of the destroyed Yakov. Parts of it still lay there smoldering. He broke off one particular finger in a crackling noise that made Aneptius turn away in disgust. Marcellus joined his friend and showed off the prize he had just received. It was the crisply burnt finger of the vampire with a large golden ring emblazoned with some sort of newt emblem that could no longer be made out. Marcellus smiled as he held it up in triumph. This is for the Isheki, to prove the job is done. He laughed a little. They have to have something to keep us Koldun coming back to them. Aneptius spiraled in his mind. So it was true? Marcellus actually was a magic user. The dwarf was shocked. He almost instinctively jumped back from his friend. So that's where you've been all these years. What do they do to you all? I wasn't sure if you were dead or not. Aneptius winked knowingly at his friend. Although, I had a feeling we'd see each other again, just hoping it'd be under better circumstances. Marcellus leaned over to patronize him with a pat on his head. Yep, no one is allowed to know where we were. Felt bad at first for my family, but it all seemed to fit in place. They do well with the other two brothers at home, and one less mouth to feed. The Koldun are trained alongside the Isheki, to get us used to martial abilities with magic. I'd say it's worked pretty well from what we did to that vampire, eh? Aneptius agreed wholeheartedly with his friend. I'd probably be dead without you, Marcellus. What are we going to do with all these bodies? Marcellus waved the thought away. No one comes up here to these caves, and all the witnesses are dead, he thought for a minute. Not that that matters. You can thank this wonderful kingdom for that. The Isheki would intervene on our behalf if that ass or Norian tried to question us. Looks like he won't bother now, though. He laughed heartily at the prospect, then shook his head in disappointment. They both looked back at all the bodies from the cave mouth. Then Aneptius joined him and smiled suddenly. Yeah, you're right. Plus the carrion will get him. After his last look at that ruckus there, Aneptius finally turned to leave with Marcellus at his side. That's the end of Chapter 13, Captive, from my first book, Rumblings in Remarden. And if you like these, if you want to pick up a copy, look up J.S. Golson, and that's Gholson, on Amazon. That's where you can find all my works. The sequel to this book is out now. It's called Deviations of Defiance. I'll start reading that one after I'm done with this one. I have another book of short stories that are already out now called The Kingdom Swell. And you'll find that you look up my name again. So pick it up if you'd like to help me out, support me, and of course like, share, and subscribe it. Share it to your friends and subscribe for yourself. Thank you.